She didn't just want to influence the Roman Empire, she wanted to control it. Agrippina the Younger was the most powerful woman in Rome, capable of scheming, seducing, and even killing to put her son on the throne. But how far can a mother go in the name of power? Picture this. You're born into the most powerful family in the ancient world, but you're a woman in a society that sees you as nothing more than a political pawn. What would you do? Would you accept your fate, or would you rewrite the rules entirely? Agrippina the Younger chose to rewrite them, and trust me, her story is more twisted than any modern thriller you've ever watched. Born around 15 years after Christ, Agrippina wasn't just any Roman woman. She was the granddaughter of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the daughter of Germanicus, a war hero so beloved that when he died mysteriously, people whispered about poison and conspiracy. Growing up in the imperial palace, little Agrippina learned early that in Rome, family dinners could be deadly affairs. Her childhood was like a master class in survival. She watched relatives disappear in the night, saw uncles and cousins executed for treason, and witnessed her own mother, Agrippina the Elder, starve herself to death in exile. Can you imagine? This girl learned before she could even read properly that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. When her brother Caligula became emperor, you'd think things would get better for her. Wrong. Caligula was paranoid, cruel, and saw threats everywhere, even in his own sisters. He accused Agrippina of plotting against him and shipped her off to a tiny island in the Mediterranean. She was barely 20 years old, stripped of everything, left to survive on scraps. But here's where Agrippina's genius shows. Instead of breaking down, she used those years of exile to plan. She studied power, understood its patterns, and when Caligula was assassinated and her uncle Claudius became emperor, she was ready. Claudius brought her back to Rome, thinking he was being merciful to a grieving niece. He had no idea he was welcoming back a woman who had spent years plotting her return to power. Agrippina didn't just want to come home, she wanted to rule. And here's the thing about Agrippina that makes her story so compelling. She understood something that most people in her position never figured out. She realized that in a world where women couldn't officially hold power, the key was to become indispensable to the men who did. What would you do to secure your family's future? Would you be willing to challenge an empire? Today on Imperium Chronicles, we're diving deep into Agrippina's life, her ruthless strategy, her limitless ambition, and a legacy that echoes through history. Don't miss this epic tale of betrayal, blood, and absolute power. If you love real stories full of intrigue, like, share, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles so we can explore the secrets of antiquity together. Imagine being born with the weight of an empire on your shoulders before you can even walk. That was Agrippina's reality. She entered the world around 15 years after Christ into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the most powerful family in human history at that time. But here's the thing about being born at the top. The fall is always longer and more brutal. Her grandfather was Augustus, the man who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. Her father was Germanicus, a military genius so beloved by the Roman people that they called him the perfect Roman. Soldiers would die for him, citizens would cheer his name in the streets, and even the Senate respected him. But in the imperial family, being too popular was often a death sentence. When Agrippina was just 3 years old, her father died mysteriously while campaigning in Syria. The official story was illness, but whispers spread like wildfire through Rome. Poison, they said. Jealousy from Emperor Tiberius, who couldn't stand Germanicus's popularity. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that little Agrippina learned her first lesson. In her family, even heroes weren't safe. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, refused to stay quiet about her husband's death. She demanded justice, asked uncomfortable questions, and made powerful enemies. The result? She was exiled to a remote island where she eventually starved herself to death rather than give her enemies the satisfaction of executing her. Agrippina was barely a teenager when she lost her mother, but she was already learning that in Rome, speaking truth to power could cost you everything. Growing up in the imperial palace was like living in a beautiful prison. Every conversation was a potential trap, every smile could hide a dagger, and every family dinner might be your last. Agrippina watched her brothers and cousins navigate this deadly game, and she absorbed every lesson. She learned to read faces, to detect lies, to understand when someone was planning your downfall. But here's what made Agrippina different from other imperial women. She didn't just survive this environment, she thrived in it. While other noble girls were learning to embroider, she was studying power dynamics. While they practiced music, she was memorizing who owed whom favors and who held grudges. Then came the ultimate test. Her brother Caligula became emperor, and at first things looked promising. He honored their father's memory, brought their mother's ashes back to Rome, and seemed to care about family loyalty. But power corrupted Caligula quickly and completely. He became paranoid, cruel, and saw enemies everywhere, even in his own sisters. The breaking point came when Caligula accused Agrippina of plotting against him. Whether she actually was or not, we'll never know for certain. But knowing Agrippina's character, it's entirely possible she was at least thinking about it. Caligula had become a monster, and she probably figured Rome would be better off without him. His response was swift and brutal. He stripped her of her wealth, her titles, and her freedom. At just 22 years old, Agrippina found herself on a tiny island called Pontia, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of loyal servants. Most people would have been broken by this experience, but Agrippina wasn't most people. During those dark months of exile, something crystallized in her mind. She realized that surviving in Rome required more than just noble blood or family connections. It required ruthlessness, patience, and the ability to think 3 moves ahead of everyone else. She had tasted betrayal from her own brother, and she would never be that vulnerable again. When news reached her island that Caligula had been assassinated by his own guards, Agrippina didn't just feel relief, she felt opportunity. Her uncle Claudius was now emperor, and he was calling all the exiles home. But Agrippina wasn't coming back as the same naive girl who had been banished. She was returning as a woman who understood that in Rome you were either the hunter or the prey, and she had already decided which one she was going to be. When Agrippina returned from exile, she faced a harsh reality. She was a woman in ancient Rome, with no money, no husband, and no political protection. In that world, those 3 things spelled disaster. But Agrippina had learned something during her time on that lonely island. She understood that marriage wasn't about love or happiness. It was about survival and strategy. Her first move was brilliant and calculated. She married Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man whose name was almost as intimidating as his reputation. Domitius came from one of Rome's oldest and most powerful families, but he was also known for being incredibly cruel. Ancient historians tell us he was the kind of man who would run down pedestrians with his chariot just for fun, and once gouged out a knight's eye during an argument at the Forum. Why would Agrippina choose such a monster? Simple. He had 3 things she desperately needed: wealth, political connections, and most importantly, he was unlikely to try to control her. Domitius was so focused on his own brutal pleasures that he probably didn't care what his wife was plotting behind the scenes. The marriage produced exactly what Agrippina was hoping for: a son. When little Lucius Domitius was born around 37 years after Christ, Agrippina looked at her baby and saw something his father never could. She saw the future emperor of Rome. From the moment that child drew his first breath, every decision Agrippina made revolved around one goal: putting her son on the throne. But fate had more cards to play. When Domitius died suddenly, probably from natural causes, though nothing was ever certain in that family, Agrippina found herself a widow at 28. She was young, beautiful, wealthy, and now completely free to make her next move. And what a move it was. She set her sights on the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Claudius, her own uncle. Now, marrying your uncle might sound shocking to us today, But in ancient Rome, it wasn't unheard of in imperial families. What was shocking was Agrippina's audacity in pursuing him. Claudius was around 60 years old, physically awkward, and had a stutter that made him the target of jokes throughout his youth. But he was also surprisingly intelligent, and more importantly, he was the emperor. Agrippina recognized what others missed. Beneath that stammering exterior was a sharp mind and a lonely man who craved respect and affection. She played her cards perfectly. Agrippina didn't just rely on her beauty, though by all accounts she was stunning. She engaged Claudius intellectually, discussed politics with him, and made him feel like the brilliant ruler he always wanted to be seen as. She listened to his historical theories, laughed at his jokes, and gradually made herself indispensable to him. The seduction worked. In 49 years after Christ, Emperor Claudius married his niece Agrippina in a ceremony that shocked even jaded Roman society. Overnight, she had gone from exile to empress. But Agrippina wasn't content to just wear pretty dresses and host dinner parties. She had a much bigger plan in mind. Here's where her strategic genius really shows. Claudius already had a son from his previous marriage, a boy named Britannicus, who was the obvious heir to the throne. But Agrippina knew that obvious didn't mean guaranteed. She began working on Claudius, drop by drop, conversation by conversation, convincing him that adopting her son Nero would strengthen the dynasty. She played on Claudius's insecurities brilliantly. She reminded him how Augustus had adopted heirs who weren't his biological sons, and how successful that had been. She pointed out that Nero was older than Britannicus and could take on responsibilities sooner. She emphasized that her son carried the blood of both the Julio and Claudian lines, making him the perfect bridge between the family's different branches. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Agrippina never presented it as choosing between the boys. Instead, she framed it as giving Claudius more options, more security, more legacy. She made him believe that adopting Nero was his idea, his brilliant solution to ensuring the empire's stability. And it worked. In 50 years after Christ, Emperor Claudius officially adopted 12-year-old Nero, giving him precedence over his own biological son, Britannicus. The boy who had been born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar, heir to the Roman Empire. But here's the thing about getting everything you want. It often comes with consequences you never anticipated. By placing Nero in line for the throne, Agrippina had created a situation where her son and Britannicus were now rivals for the ultimate prize. She had turned two boys into potential enemies, and in the imperial family, rivalries had a way of ending in blood. What Agrippina didn't realize yet was that she had also created a monster who would eventually turn on her. But that's a story for later. For now, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The power behind the throne, with her son positioned to rule the world. By 54 years after Christ, Agrippina had everything she'd ever dreamed of. She was empress of Rome. Her son Nero was officially the heir, and she wielded more power than any woman in Roman history. But there's something about absolute power that makes people paranoid, and Claudius was starting to have second thoughts about the choices he'd made. Picture this. You're the emperor of the most powerful empire in the world, but you're beginning to realize that your wife might be more dangerous than your enemies. That's exactly what was happening to Claudius. He started noticing things. The way senators would look to Agrippina before answering his questions. How decisions he thought he'd made somehow became decisions she had suggested. The uncomfortable truth was dawning on him. He wasn't really ruling Rome anymore. Agrippina was. The breaking point came when Claudius began showing renewed interest in his biological son, Britannicus. He started spending more time with the boy, talking about his future, and worst of all, from Agrippina's perspective, he began questioning whether adopting Nero had been the right decision. Some historians believe Claudius was even considering changing his will to make Britannicus his primary heir again. For Agrippina, this was more than just a political setback. This was an existential threat. She had sacrificed everything, manipulated everyone, and destroyed countless lives to get Nero into position. The idea of losing it all because Claudius was having paternal feelings about his biological son was absolutely unacceptable. So she made the most calculated decision of her life. If Claudius was becoming a problem, then Claudius had to go. And she knew exactly how to do it. Ancient Rome was practically the poisoning capital of the world. It was so common that wealthy Romans employed food tasters and carried antidotes wherever they went. Agrippina herself was known to carry a universal antidote called Mithridatium, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients that was supposed to protect against most known poisons. The irony is beautiful, isn't it? The woman who was about to commit the ultimate poisoning was also the most protected against it. The method she chose was brilliant in its simplicity. Claudius loved mushrooms, particularly an expensive variety that grew wild in the mountains. Agrippina arranged for his favorite dish to be prepared by a woman named Locusta, who was essentially ancient Rome's most skilled poisoner. Think of her as a consultant who specialized in making deaths look natural. On the night of October 13th, 54 years after Christ, Claudius sat down for what he thought would be a normal dinner with his wife. The mushrooms were perfectly prepared, seasoned exactly how he liked them. He ate heartily, probably complimenting Agrippina on the meal. Within hours, he was writhing in agony. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. Some accounts suggest that when the initial poison didn't work fast enough, Agrippina had a backup plan. She supposedly had a physician named Xenophon who was treating Claudius, dip a feather in additional poison, and use it to induce vomiting. The idea was to help the emperor purge the poison, but the feather itself was tainted with an even deadlier substance. Whether it was the mushrooms, the feather, or both, Claudius died that night. The official cause was given as a sudden illness, and most Romans probably believed it. After all, Claudius was around 64 years old and had never been particularly healthy. Within hours of Claudius's death, 16-year-old Nero was proclaimed emperor. The transition was so smooth, so perfectly orchestrated, that it was clear Agrippina had been planning this moment for years. She had anticipated every detail, prepared every ally, and eliminated every obstacle. And for the first time in Roman history, a woman was effectively ruling the empire. Oh, Nero was the official emperor, but everyone knew who was really making the decisions. Agrippina attended Senate meetings, received foreign ambassadors, and made policy decisions. Coins were minted with both their faces, showing them as equal partners in power. She had done it. Through marriages, manipulations, and murder, Agrippina had achieved what no Roman woman before her had ever managed: absolute control over the most powerful empire in human history. Her son was emperor. Her enemies were dead or silenced, and she was the shadow ruler of the known world. But here's the thing about shadows. They only exist as long as there's something blocking the light. And Nero was growing up, getting ideas of his own, and starting to chafe under his mother's control. The woman who had created an emperor was about to discover that monsters, once unleashed, are very difficult to control. Did you know that Agrippina carried a universal antidote to avoid being poisoned? If you're enjoying this story of betrayal, leave a like and comment. Would you support Agrippina or condemn her? And don't forget to subscribe. There's something tragically inevitable about what happened next. Agrippina had spent years molding Nero into the perfect emperor, but she had forgotten one crucial detail. She had also taught him to be ruthless. And now, that ruthlessness was about to turn against her. At first, the mother-son partnership worked beautifully. Nero was young, handsome, and charismatic, while Agrippina provided the political experience and strategic thinking. But as Nero grew into his 20s, something began to shift. He started to resent the constant supervision, the way his mother would correct him in front of senators, and how everyone knew she was the real power behind his throne. The breaking point came gradually, like a crack in a dam that slowly widens until everything collapses. Nero began making decisions without consulting Agrippina. He started surrounding himself with new advisors, people who whispered in his ear that a real emperor shouldn't need his mother's permission for everything. Chief among these was his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian Guard prefect Burrus, who saw Agrippina's influence as an obstacle to their own power. But Agrippina wasn't going to give up without a fight. She had sacrificed too much and come too far to let her son slip away from her control. So she did what she had always done. She played the manipulation game. But this time, she made a critical error. She overplayed her hand. In a moment of desperation, Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son who was now around 14 years old. She reminded Nero that Britannicus had just as much claim to the throne, maybe even more since he was actually Claudius's blood. It was meant to be a warning, a way to remind Nero that he needed her support to maintain his position. But Nero didn't see it as a warning. He saw it as a declaration of war. What happened next shows just how thoroughly Agrippina had taught her son the rules of imperial survival. If someone threatens your throne, you eliminate them before they can act. Nero invited Britannicus to a family dinner, and during the meal, the boy suddenly collapsed. The official story was a seizure, but everyone knew better. Britannicus had been poisoned, probably by the same Locusta who had helped kill Claudius. Agrippina watched her stepson die at that dinner table, and she knew in that moment that she was looking at her own future. The boy she had raised, the son she had made emperor, had just shown her exactly what he was capable of. If he could kill Britannicus without hesitation, what would stop him from killing her? The final confrontation between mother and son played out like a deadly chess match, with each move bringing them closer to the inevitable conclusion. Agrippina tried to rebuild bridges, attempted to seduce her way back into Nero's good graces, and even reportedly offered to share his bed to maintain her influence. But it was too late. Nero had tasted absolute power, and he wasn't willing to share it anymore. In 59 years after Christ, Nero made his decision. His mother had to die. But here's where it gets almost absurdly dramatic. Nero's first assassination attempt was so elaborate it sounds like something out of a movie. He had a special boat built for Agrippina, one designed to collapse and sink while she was sailing across the Bay of Naples. The plan was brilliant in theory. Agrippina would drown in what appeared to be a tragic accident, and Nero would play the grieving son perfectly. But Agrippina hadn't survived this long in imperial politics by being careless. When the boat began to fall apart around her, she didn't panic. She swam. At 43 years old, this woman who had manipulated emperors and poisoned husbands literally swam for her life in the dark waters of the Mediterranean. When Nero's men found her alive on the shore, they knew the game was up. There was no more pretending this was an accident, no more elaborate schemes. Nero sent soldiers to finish what the boat had failed to do. The end came in her own villa, the same place where she had plotted the death of Claudius just 5 years earlier. According to the historian Tacitus, when the soldiers arrived, Agrippina knew exactly why they were there. She reportedly pointed to her stomach and said, "Strike here, where I carried the monster who would kill me." Those might not have been her exact words, but they capture something profound about that moment. Agrippina understood that her greatest achievement had become her greatest mistake. She had created the perfect emperor, but she had forgotten that perfect emperors don't share power with anyone, not even their mothers. The woman who had controlled Rome for nearly a decade died alone, killed by the son she had sacrificed everything to put on the throne. It's one of history's most perfect examples of how power corrupts and how the weapons we forge can eventually be turned against us. But here's what makes Agrippina's story so compelling. Even in death, she had the last word. Nero may have killed her, but he never escaped her shadow. For the rest of his reign, he was haunted by what he had done, and many historians believe that matricide marked the beginning of his descent into madness and paranoia that would eventually destroy him too. After Agrippina's death, Nero tried to do something that emperors throughout history have attempted. He tried to erase her from the record. He removed her images from coins, destroyed statues of her, and forbade anyone from speaking her name in public. It was a systematic attempt to make the most powerful woman in Roman history disappear from memory entirely. But here's the fascinating thing about trying to erase someone from history. The very effort to do so often proves how important they were. Nero's desperate attempts to delete his mother from the historical record only highlighted how much she had shaped his reign and the empire itself. Think about what Agrippina actually accomplished. In a society that viewed women as property, she became the unofficial ruler of the known world. In a culture that expected women to be silent, she spoke in the Senate. In a system designed to keep women powerless, she wielded absolute power for nearly a decade. Her influence didn't just shape Nero's early reign, it fundamentally changed what was possible for women in the imperial family. The policies she championed during her time as Shadow Empress had lasting effects. She supported expanding citizenship to people in the provinces, she promoted trade with distant regions, and she even advocated for women's property rights. These weren't just random political positions. They were strategic moves that strengthened the empire while also creating precedents for future empresses. But perhaps her most significant legacy was proving that a woman could play the game of imperial politics and win. Before Agrippina, ambitious women in Rome usually ended up dead or exiled. She showed that with enough intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness, even the ultimate glass ceiling could be shattered. The question that has fascinated historians for nearly 2,000 years is this: was Agrippina a villain or a victim? Was she a power-hungry monster who destroyed everyone in her path? Or was she simply a brilliant woman doing whatever it took to survive in a world that wanted to destroy her? The truth, like most truths about complex people, probably lies somewhere in between. Agrippina certainly committed terrible acts. She likely poisoned her husband, she manipulated her son, and she destroyed the lives of anyone who stood in her way. By any moral standard, these were evil actions that caused immense suffering. But consider the world she lived in. This was an empire where political opponents were routinely executed, where family members murdered each other for power, and where violence was the common language of politics. Agrippina didn't invent these rules. She just played by them more effectively than anyone else. What makes her story so compelling is that she was fighting against a system that was designed to crush women like her. Roman society told her that her only value was in producing sons for powerful men. It insisted that her intelligence, her ambition, and her political instincts were dangerous aberrations that needed to be controlled or eliminated. She refused to accept those limitations. In a world that wanted her to be invisible, she made herself impossible to ignore. In a society that expected her to be silent, she became the voice that even emperors listened to. In a culture that saw women as pawns, she became the player moving all the pieces. Rome didn't forgive ambitious women, and it especially didn't forgive women who succeeded in their ambitions. The same empire that celebrated brutal male emperors like Caligula and later rulers like Commodus painted Agrippina as uniquely evil. But was she really more cruel than the men around her, or was she just more effective? Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and survival. If a man had done everything Agrippina did, would we call him a strategic genius or a monster? When we judge her actions, are we applying the same standards we use for male rulers? Or are we holding her to different expectations because she was a woman? The tragic irony of Agrippina's life is that her greatest success became her greatest failure. She succeeded in making her son emperor, but that success ultimately destroyed her. She proved that a woman could wield absolute power in Rome, but the cost was her life and nearly her entire legacy. Yet despite Nero's efforts to erase her, Agrippina's influence echoed through the centuries. Future empresses like Livia Drusilla and Julia Domna would follow paths she had carved out. The idea that women could be political powers behind the throne became accepted partly because she had proven it was possible. In the end, maybe that's Agrippina's real legacy. She expanded the realm of what was possible. She showed that the rules that seemed absolute could be bent, that barriers that appeared insurmountable could be broken, and that even in the most male-dominated society in history, an exceptional woman could rise to the very top. Whether you see her as a villain or a pioneer, probably depends on your perspective. But there's no denying that she was one of the most remarkable figures in human history. A woman who refused to accept the limitations her world placed on her and who changed that world in the process. Her story reminds us that power is never freely given. It must always be taken. And sometimes the people who take it pay the ultimate price for daring to reach that high. Agrippina's story proves something that Rome itself didn't want to admit. Power has no gender. In an empire built on the idea that only men could rule, she showed that survival belonged to the most ruthless, regardless of whether they wore a toga or a stola. Her life forces us to confront a question that echoes through history. Is the price of ambition worth a life or an empire? Think about everything we've just witnessed together. A woman who went from exile to empress, who transformed from victim to victor, who literally shaped the destiny of the most powerful civilization in human history. She didn't just break glass ceilings, she shattered them so completely that the pieces are still falling 2,000 years later. But here's what makes her story so haunting. She achieved everything she ever wanted and lost everything that mattered. She made her son an emperor, but that son became her executioner. She gained the world, but forfeited her soul. She proved that a woman could play the game of power as well as any man, but the game ultimately consumed her. Agrippina's legacy isn't just about ancient Rome. It's about the eternal human struggle between ambition and morality, between survival and integrity, between what we want and what we're willing to do to get it. She lived in a world where showing weakness meant death, where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, and where love itself became a weapon to be wielded. Was she a monster? Maybe. Was she a victim of her circumstances? Probably. Was she one of the most brilliant political minds in human history? Absolutely. The beautiful tragedy of Agrippina's life is that she was all of these things simultaneously. And that's what makes her story so compelling even today. She reminds us that history isn't written by the good or the bad, but by the survivors. And sometimes survival requires choices that haunt us forever. In a world that tried to make her invisible, she became unforgettable. In a society that wanted her silent, she made her voice echo through the centuries. Her story challenges us to think differently about power, about gender, about the prices we're willing to pay for our dreams. It asks us uncomfortable questions about whether the ends justify the means and whether greatness and goodness can coexist in the same person. Agrippina proved that in Rome, power didn't care about your gender, only about your ability to seize it and hold it. Her story makes us question, is the price of ambition worth a life or an empire? And perhaps more importantly, in our own lives, what are we willing to sacrifice for the things we want most? If this journey has shocked you, share with your friends, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles. In upcoming episodes, we'll reveal more forbidden secrets of antiquity. Until then, the empress who defied an empire is gone, but her questions remain. And maybe that's the most powerful legacy of all, not the answer she gave, but the question she forces us to keep asking ourselves.